Welcome to the Faith in a Fresh 5 podcast. I'm your host, Rohadi, coming at you from Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. This is episode 10 on trans identity and liberation. Welcome, friends. This is episode 10. We're getting close to the end of this serial season called Farewell Evangelicalism. Although, throughout this journey, we've discovered that it's not just evangelicals who are incorporating malformed pillars in their belief systems. We pick on them because they are the largest voting bloc in America that have contributed to the chaos we are in now. The hope is to produce enough of the receipts of all the malformed belief systems in evangelicalism and conservative Christianity, giving folks the necessary tools to ultimately leave. That might be you. That might be somebody you know. Now, you might be wondering, why should this conversation matter to you if you're not trans? Firstly, because you're a curious human being. And maybe you want to understand what a wide ethic of liberation looks like. You may also be seeking ways to divest yourself from the typical conservative ideological or belief systems that constantly pit new pariahs against congregations. It's a fear tactic. Fear tactics used in conservative churches to scare congregations away from their curiosities, from loving thy neighbor, from loving thy enemy, and basically loving anybody who doesn't look like you. Remember that gaze. The necessity to vilify bodies on the margins, to justify evangelical or conservative worldviews, is sad and weird. It's also antichrist, because who is cast aside and treated as an enemy changes to suit the interests of conservatives. Recent examples include white churches aligning with Jim Crow policies throughout the early 1900s, white churches actively working against civil rights movements in the 1960s, white churches actively working against desegregation after civil rights, which was the launching point, by the way, and you've heard this throughout the episodes, for the emergence of the religious right, where conservative Christians saw an opportunity to come alongside like-minded believers to shape nationwide policies. White churches also calling gay folks pedophiles in the 1970s, conservative churches fighting against same-gendered marriage in the 1990s, conservative churches fighting against BLM, critical race theory, diversity, equity, inclusion in the 2020s, and they like to recycle as well, conservative churches finding new pariahs by switching gay folks and lashing out against trans folks. It's true, if you've noticed that conservative Christians and the conservative right are constantly vilifying trans bodies, in particular calling them pedophiles, but when you look at the data, folks, when you look at the data, the highest incidence of pedophilia or sexual abuse against minors and children continues to be pastors in conservative churches who operate in institutions that actually generate policies to decrease safeguards that most all other organizations that deal with children have, but conservative churches? Nope. They would prefer to protect abusers in the pulpit. So who's the real problem here? Now, you might be wondering why I didn't insert episode trans identity earlier in the series. Surely sexuality and gender constructs are significant pillars in evangelical or conservative Christian identity. And you're right, because anything that presses against that white male-centered gaze is a threat. But because in this moment of 2025, and trans folks being the primary target of conservative politicians and religious leaders, who better to learn from on what liberation looks like than the very folks furthest from the center? So through the example of Jesus, where the last shall be first, this episode features two trans voices speaking to trans identity, but also graciously showing us all what liberation looks like. A picture most of us wouldn't come up with on our own unless we sat at the feet of trans teachers. Let's begin this episode with the first guest, Celeste Irwin.
Open the window to to a sky full of clouds. There's been nothing but rain now for what feels like a month. I know spring is coming, but I need you right now. I know soon the sun will break through and I'll feel your light.
So I am Celeste Irwin, and my pronouns are she, her, and I live on Tongva land in what we usually refer to these days as Southern California, but I live on Tongva land. I'm a trans writer and activist, very amateur. I do writing on Substack, and I try and stay active on Twitter and Blue Sky, more Blue Sky these days because of what has happened to Twitter. And I'm not using its new name. I won't do it. That's my only time that I will dead name someone. And I am, as you might have guessed already, I am a transgender woman and a lesbian. And I grew up in a family, pretty Midwest conservative. Grew up in mostly like mainline denominations. Grew up mostly in the United Methodist Church before they were as progressive as they are now. But in the Pacific Northwest, so it was the progressive end of the Methodist Church, but still not where they are today. Went off to college. And, I'd always kind of wrestled with faith. I was like, okay, do I believe anything? Do I not believe it? Went to college, just kind of dropped off anything like that for a couple of years, and then got involved in one of the campus Christian groups. There. Yep, exactly. I wish I could go back and tell little Celeste, hey, that might not be the best idea. That might not be the best idea. But yeah, I found myself in one of those groups, and it was a much more evangelical. Actually, they were sponsored by Assemblies of God, so it was more Pentecostal, which didn't stick with me. I didn't stay with that. I had nervousness about that. The campus group was much more interdenominational. We had people from mainlines, people from AG, people from Catholic backgrounds, etc. So after graduation, I moved back to the Seattle area, and Seattle area in 2005 was all about Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill Church.
Oh, it was happening.
Yeah,
that was the bee's knees.
Whole thing. It was a whole thing. So that's where all my friends were going.
Yeah.
And try as I may to find another church that felt okay, we couldn't find one that was feeling right or whatever. And I got married in 2007, and my partner and I just couldn't quite find something. So inevitably we ended up at Mars Hill because it was the black hole that was sucking in every Christian in the city for a while. So ended up meeting up with some friends that I knew through Microsoft Christian Friends. They told us about a church that was in Seattle. It's still there. I won't name names. I ended up getting out of that. Me and my partner and our kids left that in early 2021, coming up on 4 years now. And that was catastrophic. It took everything to leave. By then we had moved to California on a church plant with that group. That was in 2016.
That's how you wound up there, hey?
Yeah, so we sold out for this church. We were all in. Our whole life was involved in it, and we then started to see the problems, and there started to be lots of abuse. I was taking tons of spiritual abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, manipulation, the whole gamut. Many other forms of abuse were rampant, and so when we left, we lost everyone.
The whole community. That's the cost, eh? Dang.
Yeah. And we were living in a small town, San Luis Obispo, California, and everybody we knew was in the church.
Yeah.
And so we
Oof.
left
Oof.
and all of a sudden had nobody.
That's the
Slowly we
story.
got a couple of friends left
Yeah.
along with us, but it
Yeah.
was brutal. I had my best friend of 10 years, the guy who had initially invited us to that church, just
Yeah.
basically dropped me overnight.
Yeah. Yeah. Dang.
And
The cost is if you leave, you lose your support.
yeah. And I think a big part of it, and we'll talk about this when we get to, when we talk about, my being transgender and trans people and issues around that, the concept of information control, if you've ever looked at like Stephen Hassan's bite model around cults and whatever, and I have issues with Stephen Hassan because he doesn't like trans people, but information control is such a powerful thing that it's like, if you're in one of those organizations, there's things in your brain saying something is wrong. Right. But you have to suppress those, live with the cognitive dissonance, everything like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when somebody leaves, it almost becomes like, I can't talk to them because I know they probably figured out the thing that's actually been eating at me. And if I go talk to them, it's gonna cost me exactly what it cost them, right? I'm gonna learn what's wrong. I'm not gonna be able to underhear it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's wildness.
it's necessary for those groups to stay so insular.
Yeah.
Because if they do get exposed to things outside, particularly those who left, you can't, the cognitive dissonance gets too strong. You start seeing it. And so you avoid it, right? You scapegoat, right? You cast people out, you shun them, you stop listening to them because you know what'll happen if you do listen to them.
I asked Celeste to share whether or not leaving the religious cult was a catalyst to find her own holistic embodied identity and liberation. Here's what she had to say.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw where you were going with that question, and I love it because it actually ended up working both ways. Leaving gave me the space to transition, and transitioning helped me recover. I think both of them help. So let me say a few more words about that.
Yeah.
My earliest memories of wishing I was a girl, which was the only language I had for it at the time, was probably age 6 or 7. It's always been there. I remember trying on my sister's clothes in secret when I was in high school, junior high, things like that, anytime I could, and I'd be deathly afraid somebody would catch me, things like that. Anytime somebody caught me just even doing a feminine mannerism.
Yeah.
Like
right,
I would get called out and I'd be like, oh no, they saw it. they saw it.
Out. Yeah.
Oh no, I need to hide that. So I hid that like deep down. It meant that I basically, for the last several, 2-3 decades, was basically just completely dissociated from my body. Like I just could not. So I wore, I say like I wore a hoodie, jeans, and tennis shoes, running shoes, every single day for 25 years because it let me, I saw it as like coverings more than clothing, right? It was comfortable, non-irritating fabrics. I just didn't have to think about my body. I didn't have to think about style. I didn't have to think about, I just wanted to not have to think about anything because it was too painful. Never looked at myself in mirrors. I actually broke my nose in a car accident in 2016. When I was 16. It took me like 5 to 10 years before I realized my nose was crooked because by then I was just never looking in mirrors.
Wow.
That's how rarely I was looking in mirrors. And it was like at some point in my mid-20s, I was like, I think my nose is crooked. And like I told somebody about it and they were like, yeah, your nose is crooked. Like, I don't mean to be rude, but like, yeah, your nose is really crooked. Now it's a lot better because I've had facial feminization surgery last year, and so now I have a cute little nose that's mostly straight. The surgeon did a great job, but like I had to stuff that down, particularly once I was in evangelicalism. I always knew like that was, they're always telling you confess your sins, talk about all your sins. I was like, I'm never
every week
telling anybody anything about
but you carry
anything
that
to do. Every single Sunday when the pastor is like, okay, now you need to confess your sins
and
today.
your body
you should
probably
tell somebody. Always.
Oh,
always. It was a long thing to carry because it never went away ever,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And
Dang.
and so that was always there. I never had language for it. I never put the
Mm.
words to it. I think I'm trans. I did in like 2020. I told a friend, or 2019 it had to be because we were in person. In 2019, I remember telling a friend that like, oh, transgender isn't a real thing because if it was, I'd be trans. Like it was like, well,
Yeah.
I was right about part of
Quiet
that.
part loud, quiet part loud. Yeah.
Right, exactly. It's such a like we talk about with trans people, we talk about trans eggs, as before you realize you're trans, you're an egg because, at some point your egg cracks and you can't uncrack it. Right. It's, but it's a
Okay.
very
Okay. Yeah.
egg thing to say, is to be like, oh, come on, like I'd be trans if trans was real. Like,
Mm.
wait. That might be telling me something. So anyway,
Mm.
once I finally got out,
Yeah.
a few months later, I was on social media and came across a Christian trans person,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
that blew my mind. My first thought was, "Wait, you can do that?"
Okay.
Like, because it had never occurred to me that you could be Christian and trans at the same time. And my second thought was, why does that person get to do what I wish I could do? Right? Why
Yeah.
do they get
Okay.
to live that life and I don't? And
Yeah.
then my third thought was like, oh crap, I don't think you think that if you're cisgender.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. So
yeah,
there were moments here that you were piecing together
yeah,
and components and different catalysts that
yeah,
sparked your liberation.
yeah, exactly. So once that happened, I finally got to start exploring, start figuring this out, being like, okay, I think this is who I am, tell my partner,
Yeah.
talk about it with her, try on clothes. The very first time I tried on feminine clothes was like the most joyful experience ever. My wife said it was the happiest she'd seen me since we got engaged.
Yeah. Wow.
And she was right. I was thrilled. I
Mm.
like laughed and cried and danced for an hour. And I don't do any of those things. Like I laughed, but other than that, back then,
Yeah.
like I didn't cry, I
Dancing?
didn't dance, I didn't do
Yeah.
any of that, and yet I
Mm.
just felt it felt
Wow.
so perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
For the and so we did that
Hmm.
later that year. It was actually a big part of my recovery because I had by that time been doing a lot of public writing about the church that I was in, the cult, and trying to tell people what it was and things like that. And late that year, I was ready to come out, and I was like, okay, but the moment I come out, nobody's ever going to listen to me anymore.
Hmm.
In this
Hmm.
stuff, right? They're going to
Okay.
dismiss me
Yeah.
just on being
About
trans.
the
And,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
about the cult, and I'm going to
Yeah.
be completely useless in trying to
Yeah.
speak out against this thing. I ended up, and I actually thought about delaying coming out just for that.
Hmm.
And then I had
Hmm.
this view of like, I didn't leave the network to be controlled by the network.
Mm.
And
Ooh.
so I
Ooh.
actually went ahead and did it
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah.
And that was really healing to be like, no, they don't get to tell me, they
Sure.
don't get to dictate my life anymore.
Yeah.
That's not a thing.
Yeah.
And so that was really freeing and healing for that. So they were intertwined.
Celeste is an advocate for trans rights and speaks directly to Christian spaces and institutions. I asked her to unpack the approach and the reality of interacting with conservative Christian traditions.
There's a lot of history to it. Right now, for trans people, what I'll say is the Christian right really had to figure out. They have been doing this for decades, right? If you know the history of like how evangelicals came to be against abortion, right? Like that
Yeah,
was
yeah.
cynical. That was
Always a pariah.
strategy by Falwell and
Mm-hmm.
friends
And folks
to
bought in.
turn evangelicals against abortion and turn it into,
A
if
wedge
you are
issue. Yeah.
evangelical, you have to be
Yeah.
against this,
So
and
easy.
nothing else is as important. And it worked. But they, I think they started to realize, particularly since Dobbs, wait, we won on that. So it
Mm.
doesn't actually work nearly as well as a campaign issue anymore.
Mm.
Right.
Mm. Okay.
And then you look at same sex marriage. right? You look at gay people. Something like 75% of Americans support same-sex marriage at this point, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
broadly speaking accepted.
Yeah. Sure.
You know,
Yeah.
and that number only continues to go up. But when Obergefell happened and same-sex marriage was legalized nationwide, it's like, oh crap, now we can't campaign on that either, right?
Yeah.
Because we
Sure.
already
Yeah.
lost. So one of them they won, one of them they lost, but either way they lost the issue, right? And so they needed another issue. And of course, the next step and the one that hadn't been resolved was trans people. And we make an almost perfect boogeyman
Hmm.
because there's so few of us in the public eye. Most people don't
Hmm.
know that they know a trans people. It's something like only 11% of people say that they have a trans friend or family member. More than half of people say that they don't know a trans person. Now, in reality, many of them they do. They just don't know it
Hmm.
because a
Hmm.
lot of trans people aren't out. They're living
Yeah.
their lives. They pass, and they've decided to
Hmm.
not disclose that publicly, and that's 100% their right if they can manage that. And for a long time in a lot of spaces, it's been a matter of survival for them. So,
Yeah.
but like
Yeah.
trans people are everywhere, and we've always been
Yeah.
everywhere, right? Like you
Yeah.
mentioned
Yeah.
two-spirit people. Like every ancient culture
Yeah.
had gender expansive people in it,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah,
This
yeah,
is
and it
not
was
new.
good. It was good. It was
Right,
okay. That's
right,
just part of how we see the world.
right.
Yeah,
Exactly. Like we've always been here, but you know, in our modern age, it's seen as something different and bad and things
yeah,
like that. So
yeah.
it's
Mm,
it's really just we make this perfect boogeyman because we feel weird, right? Most cisgender people have a hard time understanding what it would even feel like to be trans. The only way I can get people to it is just be like, okay, imagine that somebody told you you have to live as the other gender for the next 10 years. And when you say this isn't actually who I am, this isn't my gender, nobody's going to believe you,
mm,
right? Everybody's going to say, no, 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 come on, right?
mm,
Some people kind of get there on that one, but it's really hard to understand the visceral experience of gender dysphoria, of gender euphoria, of what it feels like to be we don't use the phrase trapped in the wrong body as much anymore, but like to look in the mirror and feel like I'm looking at my brother, not me, right? Which
mm,
is kind of what it felt like my whole life. I
mm,
was like, what who's that? I
mm,
don't understand who that is in the mirror, right?
mm,
I look in the mirror pre-transition and it wasn't somebody I recognized. Now, especially since I got facial feminization surgery, I finally look in the mirror and see me. And it's
mm,
amazing. It's incredible.
mm,
But most cisgender people have a hard time understanding that. But because they have a hard time understanding it, because they paint it as being sexually deviant, which this country in particular has always had real
weird
uptight feelings
fascination
about.
about it. Yeah.
Right, exactly. There's an old West Wing quote. I love the West Wing where the president's like talking about the Christian right, and he's like, "What's the matter with these people? They can't stop talking about sex."
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
it's just this total
Bunch of
obsession.
weirdos.
The other part is that the Christian far right is still so deep in patriarchy that
Yeah.
trans
Yeah.
people are a huge threat to it,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Because if what they view as a man decides, I don't want to be this thing. I would rather be a woman. They don't see that as being like that messes with them because they see women as lesser. They see women
Yeah.
as subordinate and they're like, why would anybody choose to do that? That doesn't make
Yeah.
sense,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And if what they see as a woman can become a man, it's like, okay, can he preach now?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that really messes with
That's
them,
I'd rather,
right?
yeah, they don't want to have those questions to contemplate. It's
Right.
so much easier to produce a fear response from the things that you're feeling
Yeah.
to the unknown.
Yeah.
And that's what we have in front of us.
And if you want to hear more about that fear response and also disgust response, you should absolutely go look up my friend Billy Horde and read what she has to say about disgust and But yeah, it's a huge part of it is leveraging these emotions to create these fears and disgusts to motivate people. And you saw Trump do it in the fall
Yeah.
of spending $200 million on ads that were, if you just read the text, the ads were campaigning against, gender affirming surgeries
Yeah. Yeah.
for
Yeah.
inmates and detainees,
Yeah.
of which in the last, like in all of our country's history,
Yeah.
there were 4.
It's worth naming here that when conservative politicians bring their ideologies and their policies to the forefront and it is so off base to the reality, you have to ask yourself, what are they trying to cover? We continue our conversation by going backwards and completing that thought around church folks and where they're at. Who are the other feet people? So let's move to, is it the 2
Yeah.
feet out people?
Yeah, the next group is the people that I would say is 2 feet out.
Okay.
They have become affirming, is the way they would say it, and they're very proud of this, right? They're very happy with themselves. They're happy to pat
Yeah, yeah.
themselves on their
Yeah.
back, and they're
Straight,
really
the cisgender
excited.
folks, the straight folks,
This is
right?
the straight
Yeah,
cisgender people,
yeah.
who are and the churches and whatever, and they're like, look, we have a little rainbow flag one Sunday out of the year.
Yeah, we made it.
Right? We did it.
Yeah.
We did the affirming thing.
Yeah.
My favorite example of this is I remember coming across a document by one of the denominations. I won't name them. But they were talking about like how to guide a congregation from non-affirming to affirming, right?
Yeah,
How to get
yeah,
them
sure.
to be affirming.
Yeah.
And they like the entire document I don't believe it used the word harm. It didn't use any kind of related words. It was all about how to get to this good thing from a place that was seen as neutral. And my absolute favorite thing was they had a Q&A in it, which was one of the questions was like, if we do this, are we going to become a queer church?
Yeah.
Right?
Heaven forbid.
And and the answer that they gave in the document should have been what you just kind of said, was like, I've always said the answer there should be only if you're lucky, right?
Yeah.
Like, wouldn't that be awesome if your church was full of queer people? Like, I think Jesus would love that church. Be excited. Their answer was like, oh, don't worry about it. That doesn't happen very often. The vast majority, it's like only 5% of churches end up a majority LGBTQ. It's very rare. You shouldn't worry about it. I'm like, but your answer
What's the point of this?
implies that there's an agreement that would be bad. Right?
Yeah.
Like that's
not the standard.
Answer,
it couldn't
right,
be.
Is that would be a bad thing, and it's like, no, you need to upend that. So there are these people who see it as, yay, I've made it. I know there's one author who wrote a book about queer affirmation who literally cited the hero's journey in his own personal story of coming to be affirming. And I'm like, dude, right? Like, come on. That's not what we're doing here. What I see is what I want is the people who actually fully deconstruct, question, and do the work to understand that what they were doing with queer exclusion was evil and wrong and hurtful and not okay, right? That this was in their parlance. I don't know how we feel about the word. In their parlance, that was sin, right? That was harm against their fellow humans.
Yeah.
And it was unjust.
That is sin.
It is an attack on image bearers of God in their words.
Yeah.
And they are telling them, no, God can't have made you in that particular part of his image. That's not okay.
Yeah. And you got to force people to say that.
Right.
It's like, just say it. Say that's what you believe, that you do not believe that everyone contains the same image-bearing quality of beauty.
We need people too, and this is where I love when I see people who have truly deconstructed that, have truly come to reckon with the harm that they did, to the point that they do make apologies they do go to the queer people in their life and they say, I was really wrong to have ever made you feel like that wasn't okay. And I need to do better. And now I need to use my voice to help others understand that they're wrong, right? I need to go do the work to tell people what I've learned, that this is actually okay and this is how people are, and this is great when you let them be who they are, and that they have queer friends now and their queer friends are awesome and teach them stuff about being human all the time. My life is unbelievably blessed by the number of queer people I have in it, and the things that I'm learning from them all the time. It's incredible. And so anyway, that's where we need people to get, is beyond this like
the bare
centrism, beyond this bare minimum. Okay, I stopped doing harm. We need to get to, I love you used the word liberation. That's where we need to get to, right? We need to get to this full liberative, everybody gets to be who they are, because like otherwise you're just pushing people into boxes, right? And I've written, my most recent writing is about how the treatment of LGBTQ people in the evangelical church is abuse, right? And so we need to stop that, right? We need to stop that, turn it on its head, and do the repair work, do the care that we need to do for people who have been hurt by that for years, right? And that's where the life is found there.
Yeah, I've always been cognizant, as someone who gave up his credentials and left a denomination because they decided, as many evangelical denominations are in this moment, they're doubling down on being non-affirming. Right. But I've always been cognizant that even though I have become affirming, and even though my church is affirming, that doesn't immediately mean that we're somehow safe spaces for queer folks.
Yeah.
Until we have queer folks leading, shaping, farming, and we're almost there. I think we're like right at the precipice of that. But there's a huge difference between queer church and an affirming church.
Yes.
And affirming church is like, it's like you took the 12-step course from Black Lives and you think you've done, or here's a better example. You think that you've done the 12-step course in reconciliation, which is a Canadian thing. Yeah. And you think you've made it to reconciliation, which you haven't.
You need those voices in the church. I'm a huge, if you look at, body of Christ imagery and talking about how all the parts are necessary and everything like that, the evangelical church has amputated their queer arm.
Woo!
Right?
Oh, yeah. They don't want it. That's their loss.
Right? And they have cut it off, and that makes them dysfunctional, right? That makes them absolutely missing out on a huge part of the body of Christ.
Yeah.
And for other churches to correct that and include means they have to recognize that they're not going to see the credentials. They're not going to see the book deal. They're not going to see those things. And they need to let those people speak anyway. If they really want to get passionate about it, have the church pay to send one of them to seminary, right? And say, hey, we need a trans pastor in our denomination, in our congregation, whatever, and we would love to send you.
That would be tough.
We need that voice, right?
That would be tough. Things it's like that. I would wish. Let's transition here to. There's tension there because you're asking someone to go back into a malformed system, and try to change it from the inside. Even though some are okay.
That I'm only talking about, like, if you have a trans person who is, deeply invested in the church,
wants to do it, of course,
and they want to go for it. No, absolutely. Any trans person I ever come across who's like, I left the church and I'm never going back, I'm like, that's totally valid.
It is totally valid when you've faced immeasurable harm on your body. Sometimes you just got to leave and leave it all behind. Now, there are possibilities for liberation out there, and there are ways to find a decolonized version of the Christian faith, one that is contextual to the lands where your feet touch right now. The possibilities, however, might seem small. We need in this moment expansive imagination and ways to generate wider ethics around collective liberation. My next guest is an expert both in lived experience but also in theological thought around collective liberation. Here's Dr. Espinoza with his thoughts.
Hey, thanks for inviting me on. My name is Dr. Roberto Espinoza, and I like to say that I work and call home on the ancestral homelands of the Haudenosaunee and the Onondaga tribal nations, and they have been here much longer than I have. And it's in the state of New York, and I am situated in the burned over district in Western New York, a place where the Spirit moved a long time ago. In 2022, my second book came out called Body Becoming: A Path to Our Liberation, and it was an attempt to narrate my story of getting into my body and having a relationship with my body. And in 2015, after I finished my PhD, I took a faculty post in Berkeley, California, and found a therapist in Northern California. And I walked into my therapist's office and I just said, I want to have a relationship with my body. And that book was kind of a moment in time where I had come to really realize how important embodiment is and has been for millennia, and how we have inherited disembodiment. And so I kind of wrote about that and incorporated my philosophy of becoming in that work. And I would like to redo that book. I think that story is still being charted, and that book captured a moment in time where I was in a very different place, living in Nashville, Tennessee, and on the road full time, speaking, and on the road like 300 days a year, in hotel rooms every 2 or 3 nights, or on couches or somebody's guest room. Got to make my way to Calgary, and got to do some talks in Canada and Europe and other places, and that was great. And then there's consequence to that. I spent 6 years being targeted by the extreme right wing, and really 2 to 3 years very intense harassment that's really impacted my mental health, which is why we missed each other the first time. And here we are again. I'm in a sanctuary state, and I'm grateful to be in New York, grateful to be back in the borderlands. I grew up in Texas and did a lot of my scholarship around border thinking and the rich area that borderlands are, this interstitial space. And I find myself continuing on this path of embodiment and learning that now I'm in a place where I can take my shoes off and really unfurl.
Yeah.
And get lost in the woods. And I'm learning that the land is alive. I'm learning that there's an unseen spirit here. There's something magical. So I'm kind of returning to what I think is awe and wonder, and being caught up in the surprise of new places.
The land really does invite us into healing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's something to cherish when your body absorbs violence and trauma. And this is particularly poignant for bodies on the margins. And when you absorb those things without a home, it makes traversing these mean streets all that more difficult.
Yeah.
Yet when you can come to home and rooted in place, like all the money in the world. But if you don't have home rooted into the land and yourself rooted to the land, boy, we're missing these core formative elements that contribute to our being.
Yep. I would say it's not without complication for me because my family's from Mexico. I grew up in Texas. I left Texas, northern Mexico, for seminary in Chicago, and when I left California, I moved to Nashville to be back on the soil that I know. And living in exile in the north, in northern Appalachia, it's a different relationship I have as a trans refugee, as a person living in exile. What it means to be in the north, in the borderlands. There's a lot I think about. Yes, I have home. And yes, I think this is a magical place. And I'm still in exile. Like, I'm still displaced. I'm still resettling. I'm still learning the recipes of this area.
I love how that's a journey that would never end, that we rely on those who've gone before and those who are coming after. But we still are, if we choose to relate well, invited to participate in learning those recipes. I love that, the recipes. There's something to be said about identity and cooking, but identity rooted to your people and from the lands in which they came.
Yeah.
I'm reading My Grandmother's Hands. That's a book that has reference, and I assume it didn't start with you, perhaps does as well, the role epigenetics has to transfer trauma through your genes, through the DNA. And it starts to, when you go through and peel back the layers in your own self, it's like, that's why.
Yeah.
Oh, that's why.
Yeah.
And it's, I don't know how you have found this, but I have found it both jarring, but also when you rip the Band-Aid off, it opens the door for the next stage of healing.
Yeah. And I think that as much as I thought that I had already arrived, like I knew that the academy was toxic, and I knew that I was going to be a different scholar, but I didn't realize how conscripted I was already in this toxic environment. And yes, the targeted harassment was awful, but this is the first time I think in my life that I've had time to actually begin to repair myself. And I'll be 50 next year, and I am really trying to commit to doing the work of repair and repairing relationships, and as I repair myself. And I really feel like I'm stepping into a new fold of my becoming as I am finding myself cracked open, ready to unravel from the bullshit and really step into being in right relationship with myself and the world.
Do you find that in this space of pursuing right relationship, that your body, in your sense, is finally in the place where it can exhale?
Yeah, it's exhaling so much that I've lost 40 pounds. And I know weight is a taboo subject, but I was on a pill where I gained over 100 pounds. and I have never been able to lose the weight. And I fled to New York, and we moved to this permanent housing. We were in temporary housing in a safe house for 9 months. And we found permanent housing, and I'm just now able to reconnect with my body, and the chemicals in my body are leveling out. And so my body is releasing what it needs to. I'm still eating. I mean, I'm smoking brisket, I'm smoking pork, we get fresh greens, and I'm sauteing greens, and I'm grilling eggplant. I mean, I'm eating. Every Sunday night we have family dinner with the Zeses, and these are our best friends. They have nothing to do with church, but they have everything to do with community. And Chrissy is Italian, and so she makes Italian food every Sunday. So I'm eating, and I'm drinking that Italian wine on Sundays.
Yeah.
And my body is releasing. My body is letting go, and I am finding that I have more capacity to be myself. I'm also finding that my clothes are fitting, so I don't have to worry about, I keep everything. I may hoard. I don't know. I'm trying not to hoard, but I'm in this place in my life where I'm just now able to unfurl, and we're gonna work this summer to really get our house in order and really unpack and really settle in to this magical place, because we haven't had that chance quite yet. And so, it's Easter soon. I don't know when this is going to release, but it's Easter on Sunday, which is my 10-year anniversary of finishing my PhD. Also 420, so it's a high holiday for a lot of people.
It basically has everything jammed into one.
Right, exactly.
It's going to be the celebration of a lifetime.
Exactly.
Come on. It's such a beautiful story when we start to realize these components of freedom. And not merely freedom through how we regard freedom in the news or civics. It's a freedom of wholeness, of whole being. And that's just something that I feel that as a society we long for, but we can't quite put our finger on to what it is that we're missing. This particular episode was recorded during the Easter season of 2025, where thematically I posed 2 questions to Dr. Espinoza. The first one was around the possibilities of what the hope of resurrection looks like in our current age. The second question around thoughts on bodily resurrection, because trans folks on a critical take on the magnitude of resurrection and bodies.
Yeah, I mean, I think with regard to resurrection and the body and trans people, I think we have a particular experience of waking up, for those of us who have surgery, waking up with a new body. And then there are people who choose not to medically transition, but don themselves with clothes that give them a new body. So I think the possibility of resurrection, or how I like to talk about it, remembering ourselves, putting ourselves back together, that's really what trans people are doing, I think, and why I think things like Transfiguration Sunday, resurrection, speak to the act of suturing the wounds that trans people carry, and the ongoing remembering, restitching together ourselves.
And that's, as you use these words, they become so tangible and embodied, because it is literally about the sutures on the body.
Right. And then the other direction of we live in a time of calamity and chaos, and what the fuck do? We can spend all of our time reading news reports and watching MSNBC or CNN or whatever cable news show is available to us and stay on that train of 24-hour news and make ourselves sick. Or we can invest in recovering awe and wonder and leaning into imaginative futures and being generative with one another and making art and creating, because that is a form of resistance, and resting because rest is resilience and resistance. We need to be making art right now. We need to be making music. We need to be having, monthly Zoom calls with people all over the world just coming together and reading a poem together so we can have a practice with one another. The thing that creatives and artists can be doing right now is inviting everyone around them to have a practice. That's what I'm doing. That's what I'm telling people. If we can recover a practice and actually practice with one another, we can learn to be human with one another again.
I find that so affirming because that's what I'm doing too. And we don't have a framework necessarily. We don't have an answer key. We do have storytellers and the ancestors and those who have gone before us in resistance.
Right.
We have that. But the invitation to hold space for one another in both creation, and I think you used the words around getting together to remind ourselves, I'm paraphrasing now, of being human again.
Yeah.
Something around that.
I've been saying for a long time, we're failing to be human with one another. And if we can begin to have a practice with one another. So, for example, in our community, we gather together for a community meal once a month.
Sure, yeah.
And we had over 60 people there tonight. And if we can just continue to gather with one another and practice with one another, I think we can change the world. But we first have to really get right with ourselves and ask ourselves, do we need to repair ourselves?
Take us deeper into that.
Well, I'm discovering that, and people have said it, Gloria Anzaldúa said it, I changed myself, I changed the world. And when I began to reorient myself, and one of the things that I'm doing right now is coming to an awareness of how angry I am. And I was never told how to be angry. I was never shown how to be angry. Anger to me was displayed as rage and abuse. And I think my inability to have a right relationship with my anger and rage has caused me to do harm in the world. So I'm repairing myself and trying to repair relationships and trying to live with no regret.
What is the alert piece? What is I'm using alert or awareness rather than woke. So what is the catalyst that might compel folks to pause amidst the rat race and ask those questions about ourselves? Because I think it's easy and culturally, definitely, for us to meander our way through life.
Yeah.
Some of us are just trying to keep our heads above water. But if the start of that pandemic that's still unfolding before us, but in the first 2 weeks when everything shut down, for just a short time, we almost instantaneously realized collectively that we're not okay in our own head, in our own body for that short amount of time.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I think it has catalyzed in some ways a movement of introspection. But what would be the pieces as we can look at ourselves here and absolutely. But do you find that there are markers or components along this journey that compel folks to do that work who haven't really done it before?
Well, I think a lot of people right now are waking up and kind of realizing, oh shit. And I think there's a range of emotions happening. There's despair, there's anger, there's rage, there's sadness, and all these feelings belong, and they're all interconnected to one another. And so, I think the way in which we recover democracy is by returning to ourselves and each other. And so, for me, this is about how do we resurrect democracy? How do we build another possible world? What does it mean to love your neighbor? It means to love yourself first and endeavor to love your neighbor as well as you love yourself. And if we don't love ourselves very well, it's going to be real hard for us to love our neighbors. And I think we see that.
Yeah. Ooh. We see the beastly response of a hatred of the selves being displayed in policy on the daily. Where do you find your hope?
My cats, who all they want is to be cared for, and all I want to do is care well. And so I'm focused on my cats. I find my hope in people who are willing to be honest with their own search for meaning making, and to know that there are other people who don't have it figured out. I find my hope at this small town bar on Tuesday nights with my friend Brian when we are on the whiskey tour. And we don't know anything about whiskey, but we're doing this tour together. And each Tuesday, we sample a new whiskey and we discover something new about each other. I find hope in that. I find hope in the small practices. I put my phone to bed every night at about 10 o'clock. I put my phone to bed and my watch to bed. And the first thing I do in the morning is say good morning to my wife instead of reaching for my phone. I try to practice being human instead of getting wrapped up in these devices that control us.
This is your wheelhouse to name for listeners. Your wheelhouse. I remember reading it in your book. And would you distill the threat? I will say but I'll say the threat of our democracy right now can be distilled down into a base element of a love for one another and a love for ourselves.
I think if we're not in right relationship with ourselves, each other, and the land and the animals, how can there be an ecosystem of democracy flourish?
Someone would oppose that, and their picture of democracy would literally be in the opposition of those elements, to say that the land is there to be subdued and that the animals are there for us to govern or to lord over, or that the resources are there for exploitation, to enrich ourselves. You know where I'm going, with this. What is the shift? Because when we look at both Christianity, we look at society in general, we look at the intersections of power and how they operate. It's very easy to adopt a story that's ridiculous. Those things are there for us to take and use and to enrich ourselves. Why not that path?
Well, let's remember narratives drive behavior. And so stories are what make up narratives that then drive our behavior. And so if the story we're telling ourselves is that we are to dominate instead of being good stewards, then that's going to turn into a narrative of the logic of domination. And that logic is going to drive our behavior. But if instead, if the story we're telling ourselves is God has called us to be stewards of everything, then the narrative framework, it has to be relationship or relationality. Because if we're supposed to be stewards of everything, ourselves included, But that means we need to be in right relationship with ourselves, with our animals, with the land, with everything. That's a very different narrative than the narrative that is driven by the logic of domination.
When I look at overarching narratives, it fundamentally opposes some of the great foundational myths of the Americas around manifest destiny, around doctrine of discovery, around the tenets of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
You're adopting indigenous ways of thinking.
Yeah.
But it's fundamentally opposed to those aspects, to those stories. They are in opposition to one another. And, I asked you about hope. When I look at those who are bound by those systems and narratives, it does not give me, I wake up more days than not where I don't have hope that narrative and folks ensnared within it will shift. So where's the inbreaking of the light? And that's such a crucial question, because right now we see the abhorrent behavior of an administration and folks are reaching for the light. Where's the light?
Well, I want to say the light is emerging, and what you pay attention to grows. The light is there. In fact, heliotropism is plants grow toward the light. So let's bring in more light. Let's pay attention to the light. Let's let light emerge. Let's pay attention.
Deep gratitude for Celeste and Roberto for coming through on this podcast and sharing so honestly and vulnerably, and also paving some possibilities, those pathways, for the rest of us to figure out the magnitude and the expansiveness of liberation that is before us. We can choose to walk those paths, or we can continue to remain steeped in hatred. What's left in store? 2 episodes. The next episode will be on belonging and liberation, and then the final episode to wrap up this serial season. I'm not going to leave you hanging. I actually posed a question to almost all of my guests, and I asked them, what does belonging and liberation look like now? And they gave their thoughts. And I put them all in one episode. Episode 11 and 12, coming next.
I know spring is coming, but I need you right now. I know soon the sun will break through and I'll feel your light. Open the window to a sky full of clouds. There's been nothing but rain now for what feels like a month. Open the window to a sky full of clouds. There's been nothing but rain now for what feels like a month. I know spring is coming, but I need you right now. I know soon the sun will break through and I'll feel your light. I know spring is coming, but I need you right now. I know soon the sun will break through and I'll feel your light. I'll feel your light. I need